The headlights cut through the thick fog of that Tuesday night like two predatory eyes searching for prey. It was exactly 11:58 when the heavy diesel engine of the moving truck rumbled onto Willow Creek Lane, shattering the perfect silence of our sleeping suburb. Most people would have been asleep, safe in their beds, oblivious to the crime that was about to take place under the cover of darkness. But this was not an ordinary neighborhood, and Mrs. Eleanor Vance was not just an ordinary neighbor. To the driver of that truck and to the man sitting in the passenger seat nervously checking his expensive watch, the street looked empty. The houses were dark. The driveways were still. It looked like the perfect extraction. They thought they were invisible. They thought they had won. They thought that because Eleanor was 82 years old, frail, and suffering from memory lapses, she was an easy target. A loose end to be tied up and shipped off to a state facility 3 counties away while they liquidated her assets. I was standing behind the curtains of my living room window, my hand tight around the cold ceramic of my coffee mug, though the coffee had gone cold hours ago. I wasn't watching alone. Across the street, behind the oak tree, I saw the faint glow of a cigarette. That was Mr. Henderson, the retired Marine. 2 doors down, the porch light flickered once, a signal from Sarah, the night shift nurse who had stayed home specifically for this moment. They had no idea. They had planned this for weeks, isolating her, cutting her phone lines, telling us she was sick, telling us she wanted to leave. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the eyes that watch from behind the lace curtains. They underestimated the loyalty of people who have lived side by side for 40 years. When the air brakes of the truck hissed, bringing the massive vehicle to a halt right in front of Eleanor's Victorian porch, I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage. I watched the passenger door open. I saw him step out. Richard, her so-called nephew. The man who had smiled at us at the summer barbecue while calculating the square footage of the lot. He looked left. He looked right. He signaled the driver to kill the lights. He walked up the path to the front door, the key already in his hand, ready to drag an old woman out of the only home she had ever known. I checked my phone. The group chat was silent, but the screen was lit up with a single word from every house on the block. Ready. I took a deep breath, unlocked my front door, and stepped out into the cool night air. The truck was here. The villain was at the door. But the entire neighborhood was waiting outside, and tonight, nobody was going anywhere. To understand why we were all standing in the dark at midnight, risking our safety for an old woman, you have to understand who Mrs. Eleanor Vance was to us. She wasn't just the lady at number 42, she was the history of this street. I moved here 15 years ago, a divorced man trying to piece his life back together, feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The first day I was unpacking, struggling with a heavy sofa, a small, white-haired woman appeared at the edge of my lawn with a tray of iced tea and a plate of warm cinnamon scones. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry into why I was alone or why my eyes were red. She just set the tray down on a moving box, patted my arm with a hand that felt like dry paper but held the strength of iron and said, "Welcome home. You look like you need some sugar." That was Eleanor. She knew everyone's birthday, not because she wrote them down, but because she cared. She knew when Sarah's baby was teething and would leave herbal remedies on the doorstep. She knew when Mr. Henderson's PTSD was flaring up and would simply sit on his porch in silence, knitting, just so he wouldn't be alone with his demons. Her house was a museum of memories, smelling of lavender wax and old books. The garden was her pride, roses that had won county awards in the 90s, hydrangeas that seemed to bloom even in the harshest winters. She was the grandmother to children who didn't belong to her, the confidant to wives who were lonely, the anchor for all of us. But time, as it always does, had started to chip away at her armor. About 6 months ago, we noticed the changes. She would forget the kettle on the stove. She would call me by her late husband's name, Arthur. She would stand in the middle of her driveway, looking at the sky, confused about the time of day. We didn't judge her. We stepped up. Sarah checked her blood pressure. I fixed her loose shingles. Mr. Henderson mowed her lawn. We had a system. We were a family. And then he arrived. Richard. He showed up in a sleek silver sedan that looked too clean for our dusty streets. He wore suits that cost more than my car and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He introduced himself as the distant nephew, the son of a cousin Eleanor hadn't seen in decades. He said he was there to help. He said he was there to take care of her. At first, we were relieved. We thought finally family, someone to handle the medical bills, the heavy lifting. But the relief didn't last long. It started with small things. The garden, Eleanor's pride and joy, began to wither. I asked Richard if he needed help watering, and he dismissed me with a wave of his hand, saying, "Oh, don't worry. The landscaping crew will handle it when we renovate." Renovate? Eleanor had always said she wanted the house to stay exactly as Arthur had left it. Then the windows were closed. The curtains were drawn. The daily walks stopped. When I knocked on the door to bring her mail, Richard would answer, cracking the door only an inch, blocking the view with his shoulder. "She's resting," he would say. "She's having a bad day. She doesn't recognize anyone right now. It's better if you don't upset her." I accepted it the first few times. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe her dementia was progressing faster than we realized. But the gut feeling, that primitive instinct that tells you there is a wolf in the fold, wouldn't go away. I remember standing on my porch one evening, looking at her dark house, feeling a knot in my stomach. It was too quiet. The soul of the house was being suffocated. The first real crack in the facade appeared on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the truck arrived. I was coming home early from work, dodging puddles, when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A massive, rusted industrial dumpster had been delivered to Eleanor's driveway. It sat there like an ugly scar against the beautiful white siding of her home. Richard was there, in his shirt sleeves, hauling black garbage bags out of the front door and tossing them into the metal container with a carelessness that made my blood boil. These weren't just trash bags. I could hear the sound of things breaking as they hit the bottom of the dumpster. Glass, wood, ceramics. I walked over, trying to keep my voice casual. "Getting rid of some junk?" I asked, leaning against the fence. Richard jumped, startled. He hadn't seen me approach. He quickly composed himself, smoothing his hair. "Just clearing out the clutter," he said, forcing a smile. "Aunt Eleanor is a hoarder, you know. It's a health hazard. We need to sanitize the environment for her safety." I nodded slowly, but my eyes were scanning the open top of the dumpster. Near the edge, caught on a jagged piece of metal, was a book. It wasn't just any book. It was a leather-bound photo album, the leather worn soft by years of handling. I knew that album. Eleanor had shown it to me once. It contained the only existing photos of her wedding to Arthur in 1954. A hoarder? This was her life. This was her heart. I waited until Richard went back inside for another load. As soon as the door clicked shut, I vaulted over the low fence. I didn't care about the rain or the mud on my work boots. I climbed up the side of the dumpster and reached for the album. My fingers brushed against the wet leather and I pulled it out. It was heavy, soaked, but intact. I opened it. The faces of a young Eleanor and Arthur smiled back at me, oblivious to the betrayal happening decades later. Tucked inside the cover was something else, a blue envelope. I didn't have time to look at it. I heard the front door handle turn. I shoved the album under my jacket and sprinted back to my garage, my heart pounding like a drum. I watched from the crack in my garage door as Richard came out with a lamp, a Tiffany lamp that I knew was an heirloom, and smashed it into the bin. He wasn't cleaning. He was erasing her. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the rescued album. I dried the pages carefully with paper towels. The blue envelope fell out. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, written in Eleanor's shaky, elegant cursive. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. Silverware. Missing. Arthur's watch. Missing. My mother's pearls. He said he took them to be cleaned. I don't remember giving them to him. Why is the door locked from the outside? The last sentence was underlined twice. The ink was smeared, as if she had been crying while writing it. Why is the door locked from the outside? A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp clothes I was wearing. This wasn't dementia. This was imprisonment. I couldn't sleep after reading that note. The image of Eleanor, trapped in her own home, confused and scared, wondering why her own family member was locking her in, haunted me. The next morning, I initiated the neighborhood protocol. We didn't have an official name for it, but on Willow Creek Lane, news travels faster than fiber optics. I caught Sarah before she left for her shift at the hospital. I showed her the note. She read it, her face paling, her hand covering her mouth. "I knew she was lucid last week," Sarah whispered. I saw her through the window. She was banging on the glass, but when I looked again, Richard was closing the blinds. I thought she was having an episode. I thought she was agitated. God, I should have gone over there. "Don't blame yourself," I told her. "He's good at this. He's a professional gaslighter. We need to know what's really going on inside that house before we call the police. If we call the cops now, he'll show them a power of attorney, claim she's senile, and we'll look like interfering neighbors. He'll move her out faster. We need proof." That afternoon, Mr. Henderson, the ex-Marine, came over. He brought something with him, a long-range baby monitor he used for his grandkids. "It's audio only, but it's powerful," he grunted. "If we can get the receiver into the house, we can hear what he's saying to her." The problem was getting in. Richard never left the house unattended. He had groceries delivered. He had a mobile notary come by. He was tightening the noose. But the universe, or perhaps the spirit of the neighborhood, gave us an opening. 2 days later, a fuse blew on the entire street. It was a transformer issue blocks away, but it plunged us into darkness. I saw Richard come out to the porch, tapping his phone aggressively, clearly annoyed that his Wi-Fi was down. He walked to the electrical box on the side of the house, cursing. That was my chance. I grabbed the small receiver unit Mr. Henderson had given me. It was tiny, the size of a deck of cards. I ran through the backyards, jumping the fence between my property and hers. The kitchen window. Eleanor always left it cracked open an inch to let the pie steam out. I prayed it was still open. I crept through the overgrown hydrangeas, the thorns scratching my face, until I reached the sill. It was shut. My heart sank, but then I saw it. The latch wasn't fully engaged. Richard had been sloppy. I used my pocket knife to slide the latch, pushed the window up just enough, and slid the device onto the counter behind a stack of old cookbooks. I lowered the window back down and ran. Back in my living room, the three of us, Sarah, Mr. Henderson, and I, huddled around the base unit. The static was loud, but then voices cut through. It was Richard. His voice wasn't smooth like it was outside. It was cold, metallic, cruel. "Sign the papers, Eleanor. I'm done asking." Then a smaller, frailer voice. "I want to see Mark. I want to see my neighbors. Where is Arthur?" "Arthur is dead, you stupid old bat, and you're going to be dead too if you don't sign this transfer deed. Do you want to go to the state home, the one with the rats? Because that's where you're going if you don't give me the house." "This is my house," she whimpered. The sound of a hand slamming on a table made us all flinch. "Not anymore. Tonight the truck comes. We're moving you out, and nobody is going to know. You're going to be quiet, or I'll sedate you myself." The recording ended with the sound of sobbing. We looked at each other. The rage in the room was palpable. Sarah was crying silently. Mr. Henderson's hands were shaking, not from age, but from the adrenaline of a soldier ready for war. "Tonight," I said, looking at the clock. It was 4:01 p.m. "He said the truck comes tonight. He's moving her out in the middle of the night so we don't see," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dropping an octave. "He thinks we're asleep. He thinks we're stupid." "We have 8 hours," Sarah said, wiping her eyes and standing up straighter. "I can call the hospital. I can get social services." "No," I said. "Social services take 24 hours to respond. By the time they get here, she'll be gone, and the house will be gutted. We need to stop him. Physically stop him." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling everyone, the Johnsons, the Millers, the college kids at the end of the block. Everyone." "What's the plan?" Mr. Henderson asked, cracking his knuckles. "We don't just stop him," I said, looking at the house across the street where a monster was tormenting our friend. "We catch him. We make sure that when the sun comes up, he's the one leaving in a police car, not her." And that brings us back to the moment the headlights swept across my living room wall. 11:58 p.m. The truck was idling. The air brakes hissed. I watched Richard step onto the porch. He looked arrogant. He looked victorious. He turned back to the door and dragged something out. It was a wheelchair. Eleanor was slumped in it, her head lolling to the side, a blanket thrown hastily over her legs. She looked drugged. She looked tiny. He was pushing her toward the ramp of the truck. The driver hopped out, a big man with a shaved head, looking indifferent to the morality of what he was doing. They were about to lift her. They were about to take her away. I didn't wait for a signal. I didn't wait for a countdown. I slammed my hand onto the porch light switch. On! At the exact same second, the porch light at Mr. Henderson's house flicked on. Then Sarah's, then the Millers'. Within 3 seconds, the entire street lit up like a landing strip. The darkness was banished by 50 incandescent bulbs, flooding the street with light. Richard froze. He put a hand up to shield his eyes, squinting against the sudden brightness. He looked around, confused. That's when the doors opened. Not just my door. Every door. I walked down my driveway. Mr. Henderson walked down his, holding a baseball bat. Not to use it, but to make a point. Sarah walked out in her scrubs. The college kids came out with their phones raised, recording everything. We didn't run. We didn't shout. We just walked. A silent, coordinated wall of neighbors, closing in on the truck. The driver looked nervous. He took a step back. "Hey, I'm just the mover, man," he muttered, raising his hands. Richard, however, panicked. "What is this?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Get back inside. This is private family business." I reached the edge of the sidewalk, just 10 feet from him. I looked him dead in the eye. "No, Richard," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry in the night air. "On this street, family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up." I pointed at the camera hidden in the oak tree, then at the baby monitor receiver clipped to my belt. And we heard everything. The look on his face shifted from arrogance to terror in a heartbeat. He realized he wasn't dealing with nosy neighbors. He was dealing with a militia of love. He gripped the handles of the wheelchair tighter. "She's sick," he yelled, trying to spin the narrative one last time. "I'm taking her to a specialist. You people are interfering with medical care. I'll sue every single one of you." "She's not sick. She's over-medicated," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was sharp, professional. "I can see the signs of sedation from here. Dilated pupils, slack jaw. That's a chemical restraint, Richard. And unless you're a licensed physician, that's assault." "She consented," Richard spat back, sweat glistening on his forehead. "She signed the papers." "Did she?" I asked, taking another step closer. "Or did she sign them because you told her Arthur was dead and you'd leave her to the rats?" The mention of his own words, the words he thought were spoken in the privacy of a locked house, hit him like a physical blow. He let go of the wheelchair with one hand, reaching into his jacket pocket. I tensed. Was he going for a weapon? "Don't do it, son," Mr. Henderson rumbled, tapping the bat against his palm. "You're outnumbered 30-1, and the police are already on the line." As if on cue, the faint wail of sirens began to echo in the distance. Richard's eyes darted to the truck driver. "Get her in, now!" he screamed. The driver shook his head, backing away toward the cab. "No way, pal, I didn't sign up for kidnapping, I'm out." The driver climbed into the cab, not to drive away, but to lock the doors and sit with his hands on the wheel, waiting for the cops. Richard was alone. He looked at Eleanor, then at us, a desperate, cornered animal. And then he did the unthinkable. He grabbed the wheelchair with both hands and shoved it, hard, not toward the truck but down the driveway, toward the steep slope of the street, trying to create a distraction, trying to create chaos so he could run. Eleanor's chair picked up speed instantly, heading straight for the street where the drainage ditch lay. "No!" I shouted, sprinting forward. But I wasn't the closest. The teenager from next door, the one Eleanor used to scold for playing loud music, dove. He tackled the wheelchair, skidding on the asphalt, bringing it to a halt just inches from the curb. Eleanor groaned, waking up from the jolt. Richard took the opportunity to bolt. He ran across the lawn, heading for the woods behind the houses. "He's running!" someone yelled. I didn't chase him. I didn't have to. Because emerging from the shadows of the backyard, holding a garden hose he had been uncoiling, was Mr. Henderson's son, a linebacker for the local team. He didn't even tackle Richard. He just stepped in his path. Richard slammed into him and bounced off like a tennis ball hitting a brick wall. He fell onto the grass, gasping for air. We had him. The silence that followed Richard's capture was short-lived, shattered almost instantly by the chaotic symphony of flashing blue and red lights. The police didn't just arrive. They descended upon Willow Creek Lane like a storm. 3 cruisers screeched to a halt at odd angles, blocking the moving truck completely. Officers spilled out, hands on their holsters, voices barking commands that overlapped with the static of their radios. It was a scene of controlled mayhem, but in the center of it there was a strange, heavy stillness where Eleanor sat. Sarah was kneeling beside the wheelchair, checking Eleanor's pulse, whispering soothing words that were lost in the noise. I stood over Richard, who was still pinned to the damp grass by Mr. Henderson's son, breathing hard, his face pressed into the dirt. He wasn't fighting anymore physically, but his eyes, wild, darting, venomous, were still at war. When the officers hauled him up, dusting the grass off his expensive Italian suit, the transformation was terrifying. He didn't look like a defeated criminal. He looked like an outraged victim. "Get your hands off me!" Richard spat, shaking off the grip of a young officer. "I am her legal guardian, do you hear me? I have power of attorney. These people, these savages assaulted me. I want to press charges immediately." The confidence in his voice sent a spike of ice through my veins. This is what I had feared. The law is a blunt instrument, and men like Richard know exactly how to wield it. He wasn't acting like a man caught kidnapping. He was acting like a man who knew the loopholes. An older officer, Sergeant Miller, a man who had patrolled this neighborhood for 20 years, stepped forward, his face grim. He looked from Richard to me, then to the sobbing Eleanor. "We need to sort this out," Miller said, his voice gravelly. "Richard, is it? You're claiming guardianship." "I'm not claiming it, I have it." Richard reached into his jacket pocket with a handcuffed hand, but the officer stopped him. "We'll check the papers. For now, you're being detained for attempted assault and potential elder abuse based on the condition of the victim. Look at her." Miller pointed a flashlight beam at Eleanor. In the harsh LED light, the reality of her condition was undeniable. She was skeletal. Her nightgown was stained. There were bruises on her wrists shaped like fingerprints. Richard sneered, "She falls. She's old, that's what they do." As the ambulance crew loaded Eleanor onto the stretcher, she reached out a trembling hand toward me. "Arthur?" she whispered, her eyes unfocused. Don't let him take the clock. The time is wrong." It was a nonsensical phrase, a symptom of her confusion, or so I thought. I took her hand for a second. "You're safe, Eleanor. Go with Sarah. We'll watch the house." She gripped my fingers with surprising strength, pulling me closer. "The time," she hissed, a sudden clarity in her gaze that vanished as quickly as it came. "The time is wrong." Then the paramedics took over, the doors slammed shut, and she was gone, the siren wailing into the night. We were left standing in the driveway with the police, the moving truck driver who was frantically giving a statement to save his own skin, and the house. The house that now stood dark and open, a gaping mouth that had swallowed our friend's life. "We need to secure the premises," Sergeant Miller said, looking at the open front door. "Since you're the neighbor who called it in, I want you to walk through with us. Witness the conditions." I nodded, feeling a heavy knot in my stomach. I didn't want to go in. I wanted to remember Eleanor's house as it was, smelling of lavender and baking bread. But I knew I had to see the truth. I signaled to Mr. Henderson to stay outside and keep an eye on the moving truck driver. I walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking under my boots, and crossed the threshold. The smell hit me first. It wasn't just the smell of old age or dust. It was the sharp, acrid stench of ammonia, rotting food, and something else, fear. It smelled like a cage. The hallway, usually lined with framed photos of her travels, was bare. The walls had square outlines where pictures used to hang, lighter patches of wallpaper, like ghosts of memories erased. Richard hadn't just packed. He had stripped the identity from the walls. We moved to the living room. It was chaos. Boxes were stacked everywhere, but not packed with care. Books were thrown in haphazardly, pages bent. Her collection of porcelain figurines lay shattered in the corner, swept into a pile like garbage. But it was the kitchen that broke me. The beautiful farmhouse table where we used to drink tea was gone, likely sold. In its place was a folding card table with a single plastic chair. On the counter, a loaf of bread sat open, blooming with green mold. The refrigerator, which Miller opened with a gloved hand, was empty save for a few bottles of water and a container of yogurt that had expired 3 weeks ago. "She was starving," Miller murmured, noting the contents in his notebook. He was starving her. I walked to the back door, the one leading to the garden. There was a new deadbolt installed, a double-cylinder deadbolt that required a key from the inside. She couldn't have gotten out even if she tried. It was a fire trap. It was a prison cell. "How does a nephew do this?" the young officer asked, looking at the lock with disgust. "Money," I answered, my voice hollow. "It's always money. But Eleanor didn't have millions. She had a pension, this house, some savings. It doesn't justify—" And this. I wandered into the hallway, toward the stairs. "I need to check her bedroom," I said. "She mentioned medication." We climbed the stairs. The air grew hotter, stuffier. The windows upstairs had been nailed shut. I could see the fresh nail heads in the frames. Her bedroom door was open. I stepped in and stopped. The bed was a cot. Her beautiful 4-poster bed was gone. Just a military-style cot in the corner. Beside it a bucket. A bucket. Rage, hot and blinding, flooded my vision. He hadn't just neglected her, he had dehumanized her. He had turned a dignified, elegant woman into an animal. I turned away, unable to look at the bucket, and my eyes landed on the only piece of furniture left in the room, the grandfather clock. It stood in the corner, towering and dark, a relic from the 19th century. It was the only thing Richard hadn't moved, probably because it weighed 500 pounds. I remembered Eleanor's words in the ambulance. "Don't let him take the clock." "The time is wrong." I walked over to it. The pendulum was still, the hands were frozen. It wasn't ticking. "Sir," Miller called from the hallway, "we're done up here. We're sealing the scene until the detectives arrive in the morning." "Just a second," I said, staring at the face of the clock. The hands were stopped at 4:12. Not a random time, but I couldn't place it. I touched the glass. It was locked. I looked closer at the wood at the base of the clock. There were scratch marks, fresh ones, as if someone had been trying to pry it open or trying to signal something. I filed it away in my mind. The police were ushering me out. As we walked back down the driveway, a sleek black car pulled up behind the police cruisers. A man in a sharp suit stepped out carrying a briefcase. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like a shark. He walked straight to Richard, who was now sitting in the back of a squad car. The lawyer. "My client," the lawyer announced loudly to Sergeant Miller, "is being held illegally. He has full medical power of attorney and was transferring the patient to a specialized facility. Your interference is actionable." Miller stiffened. "The patient was malnourished and bruised. We have probable cause." "Bruises from falls," the lawyer countered smoothly. "Malnutrition from refusal to eat due to dementia. My client has documented everything. Unless you have proof of intent to harm, you can't hold him past the arraignment. He'll be out by noon." I stood there in the rain, listening to the legal jargon that was designed to protect monsters. He was right. Without a smoking gun, without hard evidence that the neglect was intentional and not just incompetence, Richard could spin a narrative. He could claim he was doing his best with a difficult relative. He could sue us for harassment. He could come back. And if he came back, he would finish the job. I looked at the house, dark and silent again. We had stopped the truck, but we hadn't won the war. We needed proof, not just of neglect, but of malice. We needed to know why he was so desperate to move her out at midnight. Why the rush? Why the total erasure of her life? The answer wasn't in the police report. It was inside that house, and I knew exactly where to look. The neighborhood didn't sleep that night. We held a vigil. Mr. Henderson sat in his car in front of Eleanor's driveway, drinking coffee from a thermos, watching the house like a sentry. I went to the hospital to check on Sarah and Eleanor, but they wouldn't let me in. Immediate family only, and legally, that was Richard. The irony burned. I returned home at 4 a.m., exhausted but wired. I sat at my kitchen table, the image of the grandfather clock burning in my mind. The time is wrong. Why would a woman being dragged to a nursing home worry about a clock, unless the clock wasn't just a clock? At 6 a.m., the sun began to rise, painting the sky in bruised purples and greys. I saw the police tape fluttering in the wind. The officers had left a patrol car, but the officer inside was asleep. I texted Sarah. "Is she awake?" Sarah replied instantly, "Stable, sedated. But she keeps mumbling about the date on the clock." That was it. I couldn't wait for a warrant. I couldn't wait for detectives who might miss the subtle clues of a life they didn't know. I grabbed my toolbox. I walked out the back door, crossed the fences again, and approached the house from the rear garden. The police seal was on the front door. The back door was locked with the deadbolt, but I knew this house. I knew that the basement window, hidden behind the rhododendron bush, had a broken latch. Eleanor had asked me to fix it 3 years ago, and I had simply jammed it shut with a piece of wood. If I removed the wood, I was in. I slid into the basement. It was pitch black and smelled of damp earth. I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dust motes. The basement was full of the things Richard had thrown out of the main house. Piles of clothes, boxes of knickknacks. I navigated through the maze, climbing the creaky wooden stairs to the kitchen. I held my breath. Silence. The house felt heavy, mourning its owner. I moved quickly to the living room, dodging the scattered boxes, and headed straight for the stairs. The grandfather clock waited in the bedroom, a silent sentinel. I knelt before it. The time is wrong. I looked at the hands. 4:12. I tried to open the glass face, but it was locked. I examined the side of the wooden case. There was no keyhole. I pressed my ear against the wood. It sounded hollow at the bottom. I remembered something Eleanor told me once about her late husband Arthur. He was a watchmaker. He loved hidden gears. If Arthur built this or modified it, there was a mechanism. I looked at the time again. 4:12. April 12th? A date? Or coordinates? No, too complex. I tried moving the hands. They wouldn't budge. Then I looked at the weights hanging inside the case. One was slightly lower than the other. I reached underneath the base of the clock, feeling for a switch, a lever, anything. My fingers brushed against a small, rough indentation in the wood, right at the back. A button. I pressed it. Nothing happened. Think, I whispered to myself. The time is wrong. What if the time was the key? I gripped the minute hand, applying gentle pressure. It clicked. It wasn't frozen. It was locked in a ratchet mechanism. I moved it backwards, counterclockwise. 1 minute, 2, 3. I moved it to 4 notes exactly. Nothing. I moved it to 12 sun. Nothing. Frustrated, I sat back on my heels. Then it hit me. The date on the calendar in the kitchen, the one thing Richard hadn't thrown out because it was nailed to the wall. It was frozen on a date, October 24th. The day Arthur died, 10:24. I reached up and moved the hands to 10:24. Click. A loud mechanical thud echoed from the base of the clock. A hidden drawer, seamlessly integrated into the molding of the plinth, popped open about an inch. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the drawer open. It wasn't empty. Inside, nestled in red velvet, was not money, not jewelry, but a thick leather-bound ledger and a small digital voice recorder. I grabbed the ledger first. It was old, smelling of mildew. I opened it. It wasn't Eleanor's handwriting. It was Arthur's. The entries dated back 30 years. It was a financial log. But as I flipped to the end, the handwriting changed. It was Eleanor's. Recent entries. June 12th. Richard arrived. He looks like his father. The same cruel eyes. July 4th. He asked about the account in the Cayman Islands. I told him it doesn't exist. He didn't believe me. August 1st. He stopped feeding me dinner. He says I'm too fat. He's searching for the key. The key? I looked back into the drawer. There was no key, but there was the voice recorder. I picked it up. It was a modern device, likely bought by Eleanor recently, perhaps secretly. I pressed play. The volume was low. Whispers. My name is Eleanor Vance. If you are listening to this, I'm either dead or he has taken me. The man in my house calls himself Richard Vance, my nephew. He is a liar. My nephew Richard died in a car accident in 1998. I have the death certificate in the safety deposit box at the bank. This man is an imposter. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago because I suspected he was watching the house. His name is Paul Salinger. He is a con artist. He targets widows. He thinks I have Arthur's gold. He doesn't know I gave it all away to the orphanage 10 years ago. He is killing me slowly to find a treasure that isn't here. I am trapping him. I am letting him think he is winning. But I am weak. I don't know how long I can hold on. The evidence, the investigator's report, it's behind the audio cut out. The batteries were dead. I stared at the device in my hand. The room seemed to spin. An imposter. A professional predator. He wasn't a greedy relative. He was a stranger who had studied her, infiltrated her life, and was torturing her for a non-existent fortune. This changed everything. This wasn't a civil dispute over guardianship. This was fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder. I heard a sound downstairs, the front door opening. Voices, not the police. It's a mess, but we can clear it in an hour before the cops come back with a warrant, a male voice said. Find the ledger. She must have hidden it. It was Richard. He was out on bail, and he was in the house. I froze. I was trapped upstairs. I shoved the ledger and the recorder into my jacket. I looked around for a weapon. There was nothing but the bucket. I stepped silently into the hallway, peering over the banister. Richard was there, with the lawyer and another man, the driver. But he looked different now, no longer wearing the mover's uniform. He was wearing gloves. They were tearing the living room apart. "Check the clock," Richard said, his voice echoing up the stairs. Arthur was obsessed with that damn clock. Panic seized me. They were coming up. I backed into the bedroom, looking for an exit. The window was nailed shut. The only way out was through them. I looked at the heavy pendulum of the clock. I detached it. It was a solid brass disc on a long rod, heavy as a mace. I stood behind the door, gripping the cold metal. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy, confident. "If she hid it, it's in the master bedroom." Richard's voice was closer. "And once we find it, we burn the house. An electrical fire, tragic accident." Burn the house? He was going to destroy the evidence and the entire neighborhood along with it. The doorknob turned. Richard stepped into the room. He didn't see me immediately. He was looking straight at the clock. "Open it," he commanded the man behind him. "I don't think so," I said, stepping out from behind the door. Richard spun around, his face twisting in shock. "You!" he screamed. "What are you doing here? This is trespassing." "Drop the act, Paul," I said, using the name from the recording. The color drained from his face instantly. It was as if I had slapped him. The silence that filled the room was suffocating. The lawyer stopped in the doorway, his eyes narrowing. The heavy-set man took a step toward me, reaching into his jacket. "Paul Salinger," I repeated, gripping the brass pendulum tight. "Wanted for fraud, identity theft. How many widows, Paul? How many houses?" Richard, Paul, let out a low, shaky laugh. The veneer of the concerned nephew vanished completely. His posture changed. He slumped slightly, his eyes becoming predatory, dead. "You nosy little neighbor," he sneered. "You just couldn't mind your own business, could you? You had to play hero." "I know everything," I said, my voice trembling but loud. "I have the ledger. I have the recording." "The police are on their way back. You're done." "The police are gone," Paul said, taking a step closer. "And by the time they get back, this house will be ashes and you, well, you'll be the intruder who started the fire." He nodded to the thug. The man pulled out a knife, a switchblade that clicked open with a menacing snap. "Give me the book," Paul demanded, holding out his hand. "And maybe you walk out of here with just a few broken ribs." "No," I said, backing up until my back hit the clock. "You're not touching her things ever again." The thug lunged. He was fast, but he expected me to be scared stiff. I wasn't scared. I was fueled by the rage of seeing that bucket, that cot, that starving woman. I swung the pendulum with everything I had. The heavy brass disc connected with the thug's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the floor. The man howled, clutching his arm, stumbling back into the lawyer, knocking him over. Paul roared and charged at me himself. He was younger than me, stronger. He tackled me, slamming me against the wall. The ledger fell from my jacket. "I worked for this," he screamed, his hands closing around my throat. 3 months of smelling like old people and piss. I earned this." His thumbs dug into my windpipe. Black spots danced in my vision. I clawed at his face, at his eyes, but he was possessed by greed and desperation. "Where is the gold?" he hissed, his face inches from mine, spit flying. "Where did the old witch hide it?" "There is no gold," I choked out. He slammed my head against the floorboards. The world went blurry. I saw him reach for the ledger. He grabbed it, scrambling up, flipping through the pages frantically. "No accounts!" he screamed, tearing a page out. "Just numbers? Dates? Where is the money?" "She gave it away," I wheezed, trying to sit up. "She donated it. You killed her for nothing." Paul froze. The realization hit him, the weeks of planning, the acting, the fake identity, all for a house that was falling apart and a fortune that didn't exist. His face went purple. He looked at me, then at the lighter in his pocket. "Then I'll burn it all," he whispered. "If I don't get it, nobody does." He flicked the lighter open. He dropped the ledger on the pile of dry old newspapers he had kicked over. The flame caught instantly. The dry paper flared up. "Get out," he told his accomplices. "We leave now." He looked at me one last time, smiling a cruel, twisted smile. "Enjoy the heat, neighbor." He turned to run, leaving me in a burning room with a broken man blocking the door and the smoke rising fast. But he forgot one thing. He forgot the baby monitor, the one I had hidden in the kitchen weeks ago. I had moved it. Before I hid behind the door, I had placed the transmitter on top of the clock. And outside on the lawn, Mr. Henderson was listening. I heard the front door crash open downstairs. Not opened, kicked open. "Freeze! Nobody move!" It wasn't Mr. Henderson. It was the entire precinct. Sergeant Miller hadn't just left a sleepy officer. He had left a perimeter, and Mr. Henderson had broadcast the entire confession over the police radio frequency he monitored. Paul stopped in the doorway, the orange glow of the fire illuminating his back. He raised his hands slowly. I coughed, grabbing a blanket to smother the small fire before it could spread to the curtains. I stamped it out, the smoke filling my lungs. I looked at Paul, frozen in the hallway. "It's over, Paul," I rasped, standing up bruised and dizzy. The neighborhood was watching. We were always watching. The police swarmed up the stairs. They slammed Paul against the wall, cuffing him so hard I heard the metal click from across the room. The lawyer was already on the floor, hands behind his head, surrendering. The thug was whimpering in the corner. As they dragged Paul away, he looked back at me. "She's still going to die," he spat. "She has nothing. I won." I picked up the charred ledger. "No," I said softly. "She has us." Delusion. The weeks that followed Paul Salinger's arrest were a blur of depositions, crime scene tape, and the slow, painful process of putting a shattered life back together. The story of the midnight rescue on Willow Creek Lane made the local news, then the state news. Reporters camped out on our lawns for a few days, hungry for the angle of the heroic neighbors and the villainous imposter. But cameras eventually leave. The adrenaline fades. And what is left is the silence of a house that has been violated. Eleanor was still in the hospital, recovering from severe dehydration and the trauma of her captivity. The doctors were optimistic about her body, but they warned us that her mind might never fully return from the stress. They said the confusion I saw, the mumbling about time and clocks, was likely permanent, a retreat into the safety of her memories. I was appointed as her temporary guardian by the court, backed by a petition, signed by every single person on our street. My first duty was to assess the damage to the property, so we could figure out how to pay for her long-term care. Paul, or whatever his real name was, had been right about one thing. Eleanor was cash poor. Her pension was meager, and her savings had been drained by his fraudulent transfers before we stopped him. We were facing a hard reality. We might have saved Eleanor, but we might still lose the house to pay for her nursing home bills. It felt like a hollow victory. On a rainy Tuesday, exactly 1 month after the arrest, I stood in Eleanor's living room with an appraiser from the city. We were cataloguing what was left. The furniture Paul hadn't sold was broken or damaged. The walls were scorched from the small fire I had put out. The house felt sad, empty of its spirit. The appraiser, a pragmatic man named Mr. Finch, shook his head as he looked around. "It's a beautiful structure," he said, tapping his clipboard, "but the restoration costs, well, the land is worth more than the house in this condition. You might have to sell to a developer." The word developer hit me like a physical blow. That was Paul's plan. If we sold, he won from behind bars. "I need to check one last thing," I said, walking toward the stairs. "The clock." "The grandfather clock?" Finch asked, following me. "I saw it. Late 19th century, standard mahogany case. Maybe worth $2,000–3,000 at auction. Nice piece, but nothing that will save the estate." I didn't answer. I just walked into the bedroom. The clock stood there, defiant, the only thing in the room that hadn't been toppled or trashed. The police had dusted it for prints, but they hadn't opened it. I still had the phrase burning in my mind: "The time is wrong." I knew Arthur Vance was a watchmaker. I knew he was obsessive. And I knew Eleanor, even in her fear, was trying to tell me something specific. I approached the clock. I had already found the ledger in the secret drawer at the base. What else could there be? I opened the glass face again. I looked at the dial. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, hand-painted with phases of the moon. I remembered the mechanism I had used to open the drawer, setting the time to 10:24. But why did she say, "Don't let him take the clock"? Why was Paul so convinced there was gold? I took a flashlight and shone it inside the mechanism, peering through the gaps in the gears. Nothing but brass and dust. I sighed, leaning my forehead against the cool glass. "I'm trying, Eleanor," I whispered. "I'm trying to save your home." As I pulled back, the light caught something etched into the backplate of the movement. It was tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye. I squinted. It was a serial number, number 001, and below it, a signature: A. Vance and H. Graves, 1954. I froze. H. Graves? Henry Graves? The most famous watch collector and commissioner of the 20th century? It seemed impossible. Arthur was a local watchmaker. I took a photo of the engraving and sent it to a friend of mine who worked at an auction house in New York. I didn't expect much. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. "Where are you?" my friend asked, his voice breathless. "I'm at the neighbor's house." "Why?" "Do not touch that clock. Do not move it. Do not breathe on it. I'm getting on a plane." "What? Why? Ideally it's worth a few thousand, right?" "A few thousand?" He laughed, a hysterical sound. "You're looking at the Vance Graves complication. It's a myth. It's the lost caliber. Arthur Vance was a prodigy who worked for Patek Philippe in the 50s before he went rogue. Rumor had it he built one final prototype, a perpetual calendar mechanism that never needed adjustment, not for 400 years. People thought it was a story to scare apprentices. If that is number 01, you're not looking at a clock. You're looking at a winning lottery ticket." The revelation washed over me cold and sharp. Paul Salinger had torn the house apart looking for gold bars. He had ripped up floorboards, smashed vases, and tortured an old woman for treasure. And the entire time he'd been standing next to a mechanism worth potentially $5 million. But that wasn't the twist. The money was the solution, yes. It meant Eleanor was safe. It meant the house could be a museum, a sanctuary, anything she wanted. The real twist came 3 days later, when I finally was allowed to sit by Eleanor's bedside in the rehab center. She was sitting up, looking out the window at the garden. She looked frail, but her color was back. "We found it, Eleanor," I said softly, taking her hand. "The clock. It's incredibly valuable. You're safe. You never have to worry about money again." She turned to look at me. Her eyes were clear, clearer than they had been in months. There was no fog, no confusion. "I know it's valuable, dear," she said, her voice steady and sharp. I blinked. You knew?" "Arthur told me it was our insurance policy," she smiled, a mischievous glint in her eye. "He said, 'Ellie, if the world ever gets hard, sell the movement. Keep the case.'" "But," I stammered, "Paul, you told him there was no money." "You endured everything. Why didn't you just tell him about the clock? He would have taken it and left you alone." Eleanor squeezed my hand, her expression hardening. "No, he wouldn't have." "What do you mean?" "He was a greedy man, but he was also a violent man," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If I gave him the clock, he would have realized its value. He would have realized I had resources, and then he would have killed me to ensure I couldn't report him. As long as he was looking for the gold, he needed me alive to tell him where it was. I had to be confused. I had to be the senile old woman who forgot where the treasure was buried. It was the only way to buy time. I stared at her, stunned. The dementia, the mumbling, the wandering. "You were acting?" I whispered. "Not all of it," she admitted, touching her temple. "My memory is slipping, that part is true. The days get foggy. But I knew he wasn't Richard. I knew he was dangerous. And I knew that if I played the helpless victim, he would get careless, he would underestimate me, and he would underestimate you." She looked at me with intense affection. "I knew you were watching, Arthur," she said. I'm not Arthur," I corrected gently. "I know you're not," she said, and a tear finally rolled down her cheek. "But you have his heart. I left the clue about the time because I knew Arthur's nephew wouldn't understand it. But a man who fixes my shingles, who carries my groceries, who watches my house when I sleep, a man who pays attention, he would understand. I bet my life on you. And I won." I sat back, the weight of her words crushing the air out of my lungs. She hadn't been a victim waiting to be saved. She had been a grandmaster playing a terrifying game of chess against a psychopath, using her own frailty as a weapon, holding out until her knights, her neighbors, could make the move she physically couldn't. The treasure wasn't the clock. The treasure was her mind. 6 months later. Willow Creek Lane looks different now. The leaves are turning gold and crimson, the autumn air crisp and clean. The for sale signs that briefly threatened our street are gone. Eleanor's house is no longer a dark, silent fortress. It is the brightest house on the block. The porch has been repainted a cheerful yellow. The garden, once withering under Paul's neglect, is now an explosion of chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses. We didn't sell the clock. Not the whole thing. The auction house sold the Vance Graves movement, the internal mechanism, to a museum in Geneva for a sum that made the headlines. But the case? The beautiful mahogany case still stands in Eleanor's living room. We fitted it with a modern, high-quality movement. It keeps perfect time now. It chimes every hour, a heartbeat that resonates through the walls. Eleanor is home. She has 24-hour care now, 2 wonderful nurses who actually work for her, paid for by the trust we established. But the real caretakers are us. I look out my window. It's 4:09 p.m. I see the moving truck, not the ominous one from that midnight, but a delivery truck bringing new furniture. I see Mr. Henderson on the porch. He's not holding a baseball bat. He's holding a checkerboard. He plays with Eleanor every Tuesday. She beats him half the time. I see Sarah walking up the path with her baby, who is now toddling. Eleanor holds court on her porch, the queen of the neighborhood, feeding the baby small pieces of soft cookie. She still has bad days. Days where she forgets our names, days where she looks for Arthur. But she is never afraid. She is never alone. I walk across the street carrying a fresh pot of coffee. When I reach the steps, Eleanor looks up. Her eyes are bright. "You're late," she says, tapping her wrist, though she isn't wearing a watch. I'm right on time. I smile, sitting down on the rocker next to her. "Did you lock the door?" she asks, a flicker of old anxiety crossing her face. I take her hand. It's warm. It's safe. "The door is unlocked, Eleanor," I tell her, "but the neighborhood is watching. We're always watching." She sighs, a long, deep sound of contentment, and leans back in her chair. She closes her eyes, listening to the wind in the oak trees, listening to the sound of children playing down the street, listening to the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock inside the house. Sometimes, family isn't the blood that runs in your veins. It's the people who stand in the dark with you when the lights go out. It's the people who refuse to let the truck drive away. I finally understood that we didn't just save Eleanor that night. In a world that is so often cold and disconnected, by saving her, we saved ourselves. We proved that we still belong to each other, and that is a treasure worth more than any gold.